All right. Let's kick things off. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Changing Faces of Insider Threats. My name is Daniel Brody. I'm Senior Content Marketing Director at Illusive, and I'll be today's moderator. Before we get the webinar started, I wanted to mention a few housekeeping items. First, today's webinar will be accessible on demand at illusive.com for sharing with your colleagues and rewatching. We'll email you a link after the main event. Additionally, we would love to hear from our viewers during today's presentation. If you have a question for the speakers, please feel free to send it along through the Q&A box on the Zoom player. You can also tweet us at our Twitter handle, @IllusiveNW. That's @IllusiveNW. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the session, and if we don't have time to get to yours, we'll make sure to follow up afterwards. So without any further ado, let's kick things off. Nation states are getting into the insider threat game. We are far beyond mere disgruntled employees blowing a fuse. Insiders are as primed and targeted as any other threat, and nation states are guiding them on stealthiness. We're excited to bring together experts on both sides of the insider threat equation today, people and processes, and motivations and technology. First among our presenters is Daniel Hoffman, who had a distinguished career with the Central Intelligence Agency. He was a 3-time station chief and senior executive clandestine services officer. Hoffman also led large-scale human intelligence gathering operations and technical programs, and his assignments included tours of duty in the former Soviet Union, Europe, and war zones in the Middle East and South Asia. In addition, Hoffman served as director of the CIA Middle East and North Africa Division, and is currently, among other things, an analyst on Fox News. That's Daniel Hoffman, and Shawnee Delaney is also with us today. She is a decorated intelligence officer and licensed private investigator, also founder and CEO of Valence Group. Shawnee spent nearly a decade with the Defense Intelligence Agency as a clandestine officer, conducting human intelligence operations all over the world. She served 4 combat zone tours in Iraq and Afghanistan as a case officer and detachment chief, and served as supervisory branch chief in Europe as well. Shawnee has built insider threat programs for major Fortune 500 companies such as Uber and Merck. Thank you both for being with us today. They are also going to be joined by Wade Lance, our own field CTO at Illusive. He's been productizing new technologies in education, healthcare, and information security for over 20 years. He has diverse experience in solution design for global 1,000 cybersecurity teams and an extensive background in advanced cyber detection, as well as in cyber deception methods and platforms. Thank you all for joining us today. And Dan, with that, I will pass the baton over to you.
Thanks very much. So the focus today is on really building a capability-based strategy. You know, we look at cyberspace, it's an extraordinary force multiplier for free expression and commerce, but it's also very unregulated. And there's a multitude of threats out there which can impact your enterprise. The key that you'll be hearing about from us today is a layered defense. We're going to be talking about fusing technology with training and awareness to create really hardening of our defenses. But you'll also see the benefits of that, and we think it builds a bit of esprit de corps and probably positively impacts on the profit margin as well. A very dear friend of mine and a former colleague, FBI Special Agent Don Fries, who ran the cyber division at FBI, coined this term. It's about the skin behind the keyboard. So imagine, you know, in my old job at CIA, we liken the computer. I mean, there's somebody there tapping on the keys. It can be of great benefit, and it can also create some risks. It's kind of depends on who's behind the keyboard. It might be an adversary. And in that case, it's kind of like a weapon where it's going to get loaded and aimed and fired, and it might be fired at one of us. And so that's why we need to think about hardening our defenses. But as we do it, we've got to remember that there's somebody on the other side of the keyboard seeking to do us harm. And that's really the key to everything that we're going to be talking today about training, about building awareness, and also about fusing those two capabilities with technology. Now, the pictures you see here, pretty sure that 4 of those traitors, spies, are well known to everyone, but the guy in the middle, Herman Sim, is probably not. though he's pretty well known to me because when I was serving in Estonia over 20 years ago, he was one of my main points of contact at the Estonian Ministry of Defense. He also happened to be a spy for Russian intelligence. He'd been a spy for the Soviet KGB and carried on after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But he was a very senior civilian in the Estonian Ministry of Defense responsible for helping Estonia in their NATO membership. And he would later go on to Brussels to serve in a very senior position at NATO. In fact, he is he's the Russians' best source they've ever had at NATO. And the key for me, that the lesson learned from that is if you look at the way the Russians were able to penetrate CIA and FBI, and then this guy, Herman Sim, and I had no idea that he was working for the Russians at the time. It can happen really and to any of us, and it's worth keeping in mind that it's extraordinarily difficult to find and determine who these people might be. These 5 individuals are part of the category of malicious insider threats. They sought to do their enterprise harm. In Sim's case, you always look at the vulnerability. For him, it was about status because he'd had an important job in the police during the Soviet evil empire days, and that went away. It was about recognition that he felt he got from his Soviet and then Russian spy handlers. And then he needed some money for his spouse, for his wife. But the key is that none of us would have ever imagined that Herman Sim was a spy, and it took quite a bit of work on our part to prove that case. He served about 10 years of jail time, and he's now a free man, but with this ignominious past that he has to live with.
So I'd like to jump in and just kind of explain how CERT collaborated with Percerac, and what they did was they developed a model of espionage, and they compared it to the insider IT sabotage model. As Dan had mentioned, there's unintentional insider threat and malicious, and IT sabotage and espionage fall in that malicious category. But what's interesting is that the espionage and IT sabotage have a lot of commonalities. Most saboteurs and spies both had really common personal predispositions that contributed to their risk of committing malicious acts. In most cases, stressful events, including organizational sanctions, other triggers like that, contributed to the likelihood of insider IT sabotage and espionage both. Also, there were concerning behaviors that were often observable both before and during the insider IT sabotage and espionage acts or attacks. Technical actions by many insiders could have alerted the organization to planned or ongoing malicious acts. There are usually signs if people are paying attention. And in many cases, organizations either ignored or they failed to detect any rule violations that could have caught these people in the act. There is a lack of physical and electronic access controls that basically facilitates and facilitated both IT sabotage and espionage. And both of these categories are usually highly proficient in technology, and they know what they're doing. So what's in a name, right? We have to go through the definition of insider threat, because you and your organization need to determine what that name for your program is, and what that definition is going to be. You need to make sure that the name that you come up with fits the culture of your organization. Some industries would not tolerate anything called insider threat. I've heard insider trust, insider risk, whatever you call it. I just want you to understand that this isn't a secret program. It's not supposed to be secret. Your employees should know about it. It needs to be transparent. This on the screen is a definition that I like because I feel like it covers a lot. An insider threat is a very wide gamut. But I want you to see that even though it's an administrative step, you need to come up with a definition, like I said, that suits your company culture and program scope, size. Also, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, came up with their definition, which is much shorter than this one, but they define an insider as an entity with authorized access that has the potential to harm an information system or enterprise through destruction, disclosure, modification of data, and or denial of service. So according to a recent Forrester report, 43% of reported breaches are caused by malicious insiders. I will caveat that and remind everybody that these are what is reported. These are the things we know about, and it's not in companies' best interest all the time to report or disclose this kind of information. So these metrics are not fact or truth. I think it's probably much, much worse personally. Also, according to Proofpoint, the average insider threat cost has gone up 31% in the past 2 years.
Yeah, thanks, Shawnee. I feel like this slide is kind of like, being the bearer of bad news, right? From the Illusive side, from the, the technology platform and monitoring side, our system was designed around detecting a sophisticated attacker, nation states and criminal enterprise. It turns out over 60% of the detections that we have historically, and again, this is the ones that customers tell us about, over 60% have been insiders. And one of the reasons that we see this is the prevalence based on the other two data points here. And that's that when we look into the environment, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% on average of hosts in the environment have some sort of residue on them, stored credentials and passwords that really enable this kind of movement. And then a solid 10% of hosts in most environment have some sort of history on them of interacting with a crown jewel or high value asset, meaning that it's very simple work for someone with any kind of legitimate access into the environment to leverage this residue and move with privileged credentials against high value assets. And this is the thing that we're seeing over and over and over again based on the data.
So a couple of quick points about the state actors. Two important points. First, those four nations don't draw any distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Our private sector is a major target for Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And they will seek to hack into our private sector enterprises. The second point is that those nations bring a degree of sophistication, and so they will hide their hand and also often use a false flag. So, they very good at using social engineering and personas online. They'll do all the work to take a hard look at a company they're interested in targeting. And they might be doing that to support their own industry. So they want to steal your technology and give it to their own industry. They might be doing it so that they can harm us in our critical infrastructures. We saw with Colonial Pipeline. But what they're very good at is using our wide open cyberspace to their advantage. So they'll look at who works in a particular enterprise and they'll see they're on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and other things and develop a target profile of the people they want to talk to, and then develop a persona, often an online persona that they can generate contact. And we'll tell you as we go along today about how that plays out.
So as far as non-state actors, you see this list here. Basically, if you think about it, competitors can be just as aggressive as these state actors that Dan just mentioned. There are, competitors around the world that are reaching out to people inside companies, and they're offering them inflated salaries or inflated job titles and luring them over, people from sensitive positions. Also, they're really, especially with COVID, I've noticed a rise in data exfiltration, where these competitors are trying to get people to bring sensitive data from their current organization over. There's been a big rise in that from what I have seen. Hacktivists as well, Dan had mentioned the Colonial Pipeline. We've got organized criminal groups and hacktivists, both who use spear phishing and other cyber means, but they also can recruit your trusted insiders to collude with them. There's been a substantial rise in fraud based, again, with COVID and job insecurity. And so a lot of external actors like these two groups here are, tapping into your trusted insiders. And then the last one, trusted insiders, there are myriad ways that they can harm your organization. They don't have to be just disgruntled employees. So again, talking about disgruntled employees, and COVID, the work from home situation, a malicious actor could be a disgruntled employee, but it can also be someone who normally wouldn't commit a malicious act. Now with COVID, in the past year plus, and and job insecurity. People think they're going to lose their job or they have lost their job. People are acting in different ways. People are forced to make the decision, are they going to provide for their family? Are they going to, pocket some data sensitive IP for a rainy day? Are they going to commit fraud and try to, steal money from an organization? These are people that would not normally do it if they weren't faced with these outside pressures and external stressors. Also, companies are more vulnerable to insider threats. I mean, this isn't anything new, but with employees working from home and working remote, companies don't have the best security controls because they can't control the people at their home. You don't know if they're working on a VPN. You don't know if they're working on a router that has the username and password that the company gave them when they installed it. They've got kids and dogs and distractions and visitors, and most people are taking shortcuts trying to just deal with the stress and cope with everything going on. And so, they're taking shortcuts and causing their organizations to be at increased risk.
So one of the points that we've seen a dramatic shift in the last year based on COVID, and I think Shawnee was just pointing to this, was that, there's that feeling that you get when you're in the office, right? I know I'm connected to the office network. There's people walking around in the environment, and there's just that feeling of being a part of, and that there's active monitoring in the space. And to some extent that's true, right? Most security systems do a better job monitoring what's happening from the enterprise space than they do for someone, say, who's working at Starbucks, or worse yet, working at home. And so we're seeing this at exactly the time in the last year where basic security monitoring has taken a kind of a hit now with distributed working and working from home. At this exact same time, people have this feeling of isolation from the organization, and the temptations that maybe have been laying around. Hey, I notice on my system, I've got access to this server. I've never bothered to go poking at it to go see what's actually available, but there's this temptation to do so now because I feel like there's less monitoring. I feel more isolated from the organization. And in fact, there is a little less monitoring happening, right? So that's a real key thing for the security teams to understand, is that there's this nexus of reduced monitoring at a time of increased temptation and isolation. And we're seeing this having a direct impact in the activity of insiders and their willingness to take action.
Dan, never mind. I was going to say, is there anything that you wanted to add on this slide here? Okay. So with this next slide, what I wanted to do is just give you a case study. It's actually one of my favorites because it ticks all of these boxes. There was an investigation that I conducted a long time ago where there was an employee who was disgruntled about his bonus. That was the triggering event. But what was interesting is this person had personal predispositions. He had some psychological issues and work accommodations for those. But what was interesting is that his colleagues noticed that his pattern of behavior had started to change very dramatically over a short period of time. For example, he used to be very handsome, trim, dressed nice. He started putting on a lot of weight really fast. He grew his hair out, grew a big bushy beard, wasn't, keeping things up. He started coming to work with like sweatpants with stains and just looked kind of disheveled. Little things like his desk, it used to be really, really messy. He cleaned it off and it was perfectly clean with nothing on it. So just some of his normal patterns of behavior started to change and people were noticing. He then started posting questions, really inappropriate questions in like all hands meetings that were attributable to him by his name, but really challenging the bonus system and things like that. Because remember, he was upset about not getting this. It was actually a very small bonus. He started harassing HR business partners. He started just really voicing his dissatisfaction to anybody that would listen and people that didn't want to listen. And employees became so concerned that them and HR BPs end up reporting to security that they were concerned about a potential active shooter situation. At the same time, the organization had several media leaks. And in doing the investigation, I found out that this guy was actually accessing the leaked documents, and he had no need to know, and everything was out of scope. And to what Wade had just mentioned, he was basically poking around in databases that he had no specific need to know, he shouldn't have been in, and he was starting to conduct his own investigation, as he told me. Then there were blind postings, and if you're not familiar with the app Blind, it's where employees of companies can gripe and post things anonymously. But there were blind postings for that company saying, "I am the leaker, ask me anything." I interviewed him, and when I sat down with him, he actually boasted about his technical capabilities and that he could hide his activities and that we would never know what he was up to. And he really positioned himself as a whistleblower. He contacted a lawyer and basically claimed that he was doing safety and a safety investigation. But the reason I tell you this story is if you look at these boxes on this slide, he had all of these. He had a sense of mission, that whistleblowing, like I had just mentioned, and his sense of power. Posting in Blind and posting on these all hands meetings, he was bragging, and it gave him this big sense of power. He was taking down this company. He desired recognition. Again, it was that, those posts and talking to everybody that would listen. And all of that gave him a sense of control when he felt out of control by not getting that bonus. The sense of injustice, again, not getting the bonus. Sense of destiny, he was going to take this big company down. The little guy was going to fight the big company. And he felt a sense of loss, again, by not getting that bonus. And again, that sense of revenge, he was going to give it to him. So I think this is a really interesting case.
So we, divide the insider threat into essentially two categories: a malicious insider threat and an unintentional or unwitting insider threat. For malicious insider threats, if a company has a really rigorous onboarding practice, then you're going to ensure that your new employee is a good fit for the company and a good fit for the company's culture. The question, as Shawnee mentioned, is, well, what happens to make them break bad? And that's often a trigger, some life crisis, something that makes them seek some solution outside of the company as opposed to inside. And one of the great lessons I learned from working at CIA for 3 decades is you want to make sure that you've got the solutions that people need for whatever issues that might come up, that human resources is there for them, and all the other parts of the company that can help people through things that come up, over the course of their lives. Because if they don't have that inside the company, there's the greater likelihood that they'll seek those solutions outside the company.
Yeah, and like I had mentioned earlier, with COVID and the increase in fraud and other types of job insecurity related insider threat acts, what's been interesting to see is that, again, these cases are really proliferating. And I think some of it also is that people are starting to report and there's a lot more traction in the media. The FBI is starting to publish now cases that they're pursuing. So companies and leaders are reading about these cases. With unintentional, you see this statistic here is 62% of insider threat acts are unintentional. Again, like I referenced earlier in the talk, that's reported cases. That's what we know. So take that with a grain of salt. There have been some really interesting cases, and there are a lot of ways that people can exfiltrate data or do malicious acts. There was an example. There was a contract employee in an organization who was worried about losing his job, and so he started with his phone. He started taking photographs of sensitive internal databases, and then he was sending those screenshots to competitors and asking, for a large sum of money and offering to give them more photos if they would just pay him weekly, things like that.
Yeah, so what we've tried to do last section is to kind of build a story and help people understand the unintentional versus the intentional insider, and really the kind of some of the underlying issues that drive, in many cases, people from kind of starting off maybe as an unintentional insider, just trying to get access to something, trying to get something done. And then this transition in many cases into intentional malicious acts. So the next question on the table is, what do we do about it, right? How do we look specifically at capabilities and build a strategy that addresses what we know based on what we've seen?
So just real quick, I wanted to go over what are some things that insider threats can be. Not everybody can, thinks of workplace violence or leaks to the media as insider threat when they really are. Before you can fight insider threats on a technical level, you need to know what form they can take, and you can't fight what you can't see, right? So a lot of times people tend to think of insider threats as stealing intellectual property and kind of leave it in that bucket, but there really is a wide range of actions that could fall under this umbrella. For example, there was an employee who, it's another investigation I did, who was trying to start his own company and nobody knew about it. And he was going around the company eliciting information from other people who worked in really sensitive positions, trying to figure out what they did and how they did it so he could take it to this company. And there was a woman that he kept trying to have lunch with or coffee with. And she was like, I don't know why he wanted to meet with me. And then after meeting with him for coffee, and he was really hard pressed on the elicitation attempts, he pitched her and wanted to hire her for this company, which, is a violation of company policy. But she then reported it to security and realized, what he was trying to do. And she said that she felt really stupid not realizing that he was trying to access things. And the reason I say this is because it's really important for employees to understand that they need to keep things on a need to know basis. It doesn't matter what the industry is or what the company does. There are still programs and processes and projects that people work on that need to be kept on a need to know basis.
So while we're talking about rigorous onboarding procedures and training and increasing the awareness of insider threat, I also want you to think about all the ways that a malicious insider or potentially an unwitting or unintentional insider threat can exfiltrate data. And in getting the full picture is really important because the technology that you have is going to help you. You're already an incident response if you've got an insider threat and that individual is seeking to upload your sensitive information and deliver it to someone. But it's important to have the capability to detect that. And it's also important for everyone in the enterprise to know that you're doing the work to track all of this, because there's an element of deterrence there that people will think twice about using their email or their or their laptops in an improper way, and that will reduce the likelihood of what we call the unintentional, unwitting insider threat.
Yeah, and one thing that I want to point out here on Exfil Methods, a lot of people are going to look at this and it's obvious there are cyber means to exfil data, but the one in the top right for hard copy, bringing up another case, but people really often overlook printing hard copy documents or having hard copy documents. And there was a case that I investigated where a woman had exfiltrated, it was like 64 megabyte. I mean, I don't know what it was. It was a lot. It was a lot. And after I interviewed her, one of the questions was, what else have you taken? And I asked her specifically about hard copies. And she came back, she actually returned what she took, but she came back with a stack of binders and things that she had printed out that was over a foot tall. And if I hadn't asked, the company never would have known that was leaving. And she had actually left for a competitor too. So please pay attention to your print logs.
Right. So one of the things we like to talk about are the stories. We think that the stories, help us as security professionals kind of understand the path and the pathology of the insider and how to interrupt that process, right? And so we had a case not too long ago where Illusive detected there was some concern by the organization about some things they'd seen, not the level of visibility that they were hoping for, and so we were broadly deployed in the environment. Very quickly, we came back with a detection based on some deceptive data that we planted in the space And an insider had been tripped up by leveraging deceptive credentials that we had planted in the space. And that gave the security team a pivot point to then go focus on. And what was interesting was that when the security contacted them and said, hey, we're concerned about some of this behavior, the user installed malware on their system intentionally, and the logs that we were able to provide demonstrated that and of course the user claimed that the malware was responsible for this lateral movement that was happening. The logs that we were able to provide demonstrated very clearly that the malware was actually installed on the system after the phone call. And this goes to a couple of things. This operation was extremely sophisticated. It was, by the time we'd unraveled the whole thing, it was over a 22-month long process. There was this user plus a supervisor. There were shell companies that had been created. Millions of dollars had been taken out of the company using this process, and that this had been really a planned out and designed. Not only did the insider have a method to steal this information, but they actually had response mechanisms in place planned. If we're detected, we're going to install this malware in an attempt to hide that behavior. And so we've seen this huge increase, and we talked about this. I know, Dan and Shawnee talked about this earlier, this increase in technical sophistication of the insider based on this nexus between sophisticated nation state and criminal enterprise operating and leveraging insiders and in the environment. So that was actually something that we can use against them as we go through this process. So thinking about how we can leverage this, I want to draw your attention to the Mitre attack structure. I know a lot of security organizations are leveraging this, and they should. And the big highlight here is that attack structure lays out kind of the technical elements that an attacker goes through and gaining more access to the environment, and then exfiltrating, stealing data, or encrypting systems, whatever the approach may be. And the point to make here is twofold. Number one, the further through this process that the attacker gets, the more risk to the organization, the more data that's compromised, the more hosts are compromised. And so the sooner that we can, as a security organization, stop this behavior, the better. The second is that the insider has a distinct advantage against us as security teams right at the point where it's the most difficult for us as security teams to get them. And this is this lateral movement phase, right? So Mitre attack, really this overall area, phase 6 through 9, where, okay, I've got legitimate access as an insider to certain things, but now I'm looking to expand that into other things. And the insider has this advantage in that they know, in some cases, security monitoring capabilities. They know what they legitimately have access to, and it's very easy for these operators to fly under the radar and look like normal users, because they are normal users, and mask their behavior. And so we talk about this in many cases where we're not trying to do detection work in this space as security organizations. We're trying to do differentiation work, right? How do we differentiate the malicious activities against normal behaviors in this phase, this lateral movement phase in between systems? And so that takes us to the response to this, which is the Mitre shield structure. And the shield structure really lays out this principle to say, you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, Daniel, to say, knowing what we know about how attackers operate, right? Knowing what we know about from Mitre attack about the phases, how do we as security organizations use technical processes to lay in their path opportunities for them to expose themselves? And so I know Shield's just about a year old, not quite, but it's a great structure to help security organizations take a look at what you're doing and saying, am I leveraging the appropriate responses to what we know the attacker does? Interesting thing to note here in Shield, if you're new to this framework, is that everything in kind of that teal highlight with the dark blue font, all of those methods require deception, right? It requires some form of a deceptive method, which really lays in the path of the insider what appear to be legitimate options for movement and access, but in fact, for us as a security organization, are the very easy ability to differentiate and distinguish malicious from normal. And this is a key element that Mitre is suggesting we adopt as a way to address the insider threat. So moving along, this takes us kind of to the traditional tools versus what we're suggesting now, and that's that traditionally the tools suite, the cyber tools that we've used as security organizations really have been kind of signature or behavioral based and focused on providing a good defense, right? Good detection, resistance, and keeping people out of sensitive systems or within their swim lanes, if you will. The difficulty with the insider is they have legitimate access and they're operating more and more with sophisticated cyber capabilities. And so this is where newer tool sets that use a deterministic capability, something that is a clear-cut, look, we planted deceptive information into this environment and the user violated security policy to get at that information on their system and then use it in an attempt to move laterally against what appeared to be a very good target. And this really puts the security team in a distinct advantageous position against the insider, because now rather than using kind of a behavioral or signature-based detection, we're using a deterministic detection method. And really relying on the insider's propensity and greed, if you will. Maybe they can legitimately get access to some things, but oh, look, here's a juicy opportunity. And this deterministic kind of deception-based detection method, as suggested in the Mitre Shield framework, is very, very successful in that approach.
So this is kind of the good news about what we're describing, where we fuse training and awareness with technology. And the idea is that all of the lessons learned from the case studies that we're talking about and some of the excellent technology that Wade is describing, that really forms the content and the curriculum for the training. And it's a very dynamic process, and for awareness and making sure that all the employees are as up to date as possible on all of the multifarious threats that are out there, because they are changing and growing in sophistication.
And I can't vouch for training and awareness enough. It's so critical that it's enterprise-wide, and that your employees understand what red flag indicators are, what they should report, how they should report it, and why it's so important to report. So here is how to train employees and preempt insider threats to mitigate the risk. These are just best practices to share with your organization and steps to help mitigate that insider threat risk. First, we have stakeholder buy-in. So this is everybody. This is from the top down: IT, HR, cybersecurity, the global security or physical security. It's not just an HR problem. It needs to be everybody, all hands on deck, addressing the issue. The second is culture, baby. Like, you need to ensure that you are bringing on employees who buy into your culture and support your culture. You most likely need to institute a culture shift within your enterprise if you're instituting an insider threat program. Employees are going to have to be trained. They're going to have to understand why they are responsible for fellow employees. It's not just on the manager, and it's not just on HR. This is a whole, all hands on deck, protecting the enterprise. This also covers employee wellness, making sure to check in with employees, especially with work from home and COVID and all of these, external stressors that everyone's dealing with. Really letting people know about your EAP programs or LIRA or other programs like that. The third is employee lifecycle management. This is really critical, and a lot of organizations tend to overlook this in its entirety. But this is simply making sure that from recruitment to termination or exit, you're managing that whole employee lifecycle. Making sure you're recruiting the right people for the job and people that fit with the culture, like I had mentioned. When you're onboarding, make sure that they're getting proper training and awareness related to insider threat or cyber hygiene, just general best practices. throughout their career, again, having reoccurring training and reminders on what policies and procedures they can and cannot do. With offboarding, you want to make sure that that experience is just as positive as it was when they were onboarding. You don't want to trigger someone as they're walking out the door so that then they commit IT sabotage or slander you in the media or something like that. And termination in general, along the same principle. The fourth is encourage reporting. It is really important to encourage employees to report concerns, but also track those metrics. That will help your organization really identify, the ROI on the insider threat program. That'll help the company see that when you're instituting that training and awareness, you probably will have an uptick in walk-ins or employee referrals. And then slowly, as awareness spreads out, it should have a downtick. But what I've found is employee referrals or walk-ins, whatever you want to call it, I would say 9 out of 10 are substantiated. Employees know each other and they interact with each other and see each other's patterns of behavior much more than a manager does or HR does. Also have a confidential reporting system. Make sure that your employees know that they can report things confidentially. That's really, really important. The next is cyber hygiene. Like I had mentioned, it is really, really important that your whole organization understands how to keep their data and their resources safe and not to take those workarounds that we've mentioned throughout this program. And then finally, create an enterprise risk management program. Having an insider risk or insider trust or insider threat, whatever you want to call it, program to address this issue. Make sure you're managing external threats. Be aware of organizational factors that would contribute to an IT sabotage attack, for example. Just be prepared. And there's a lot of resources out there for you to get that off the ground.
Yeah, great, good stuff, Shawnee. I can just make one final point on that. One of the things that we see pretty consistently is like HR has an insider program and cyber has an insider program and management teams. And if you can get them to work together, and marry those programs up, it's dramatically more effective. We've seen cases where the security team is interested in doing better cyber hygiene, but they can't get the resources for it until they partner up with the risk group to help them understand how the cyber risk is feeding into the insider threat and the overall risk to the organization, and that loosens up funds to move forward with some of those projects. That partnership's critical.
Thanks, Wade. So you could see any employee could be a target, but let's look at the flip side of it, which is that everybody's job matters. Everybody contributes to the enterprise's success. And if you get buy-in, as Shawnee and Wade were just mentioning, for the right kind of training and awareness, then you're building a culture of inclusivity, which should, create a more positive work environment, so that everybody's kind of pulling in the same direction for the sake of your enterprise. Now, I don't think any webinar would be complete without a couple of good stories. So Wade's got one on a dumpster dive, and then Shawnee will tell you one about eavesdropping.
Yeah, the dumpster diving actually turned into dumpster planting. So in this case, an organization was trying to get access to a regional bank, and the cyber hygiene was really tight and they just weren't being effective. And so they got a hotel room across the street from one of the main branches and just watched the branch for a week. And they noticed the employees going out back in the alley for a smoke break, and there was a dumpster in the alley. And this criminal organization bought an entire case of USB drives, high value, high dollar, implanted malware on those systems, a few of them. And then in the night, broke that case open in the dumpster, let a few fall out on the ground that were infected. And the employees, when they came out the next day, saw this laying there. And again, very expensive USB sticks. And because of the presence of this broken case in the dumpster, it appeared as if this, kind of broken off, and it looked like a safe opportunity. The organization was able to get access to that bank's network. Sure enough, people carried those right in the back door. And so, So yeah, dumpster diving is still alive and well, and still an opportunity, and helping people understand the links that criminal organizations will go to turn employees into unwitting insiders. Again, this is more common than a lot of people may think.
That's a great point, Wade. And I'll add to that foreign intelligence services, can target your employees very easily. When people are traveling, people always have their laptop open, they're working on work, they don't have privacy screens. Some of the best developmental sources I got was by shoulder surfing. So just, pay attention and have that awareness when you're outside of your safe zone. With regards to that eavesdropping story, so there was one organization that I worked with that had a lot of foreign investors. And so they had these foreigners rolling through the offices on a very frequent basis. And when I sat down and tried to, talk about insider threat and security, I ordered a TSCM sweep, or a bug sweep, of the conference rooms that these people were frequenting. And what we found was one conference room, the one that they used the most, had a vulnerability in one of the microphones, where that microphone was left on at all times, even when not in use. So it was a big discovery. It was kind of like an "I told you so" moment. But I mean, this is very real. This is real world. This is recent.
So just to sum up before we get to questions, we've talked a lot today about a capability-based strategy. We did highlight some of the threats that are out there from state and non-state actors, but look, attribution is really hard, and it usually happens when you're in incident response forensics phase. As we used to say at CIA, to the right of boom, in a place you don't want to be. But by building a strategy where you assume you're going to be hacked, or maybe you already are hacked, that's the first thing to do. And think about your data recovery. And if you're a Colonial Pipeline, what kind of disaster recovery plan you've got offline. And then you're fusing your technology with training and awareness, and building the right kind of culture that both Shawnee and Wade have talked about. And if you do all those things, then you're going to harden your defenses and make yourself a far less vulnerable target. And in the process, create a really positive culture with the right kind of focus on support for employees, and the right kind of focus on inclusivity, which I found in my career, both at CIA and in the private sector, makes the enterprise just run that much more effectively.
All right, thank you guys. So we'll go ahead right now and take some time for questions. As a reminder, there's still time to ask more questions, so please be sure to type your most burning inquiries into the question box in the Zoom control panel. But we have a few questions here already. I think this first one is for you, Wade. So let's say you implement deception to catch malicious insiders. How do you know employees are interacting with the deceptions on purpose and not accidentally?
Yeah, kind of a great question. One of the big shifts in deception capability over the years is kind of a move off of, the honeypot, the network resource out there somewhere, and to the telling of deceptive stories on the production systems themselves with the history. And so it's a pretty simple matter, actually, to just plant historical data onto the host in a way that only a malicious operator would interact with it, right? So as long as the operator has to violate security policy to find the deceptive data that you plant, if someone uses that information, they've already violated security policy just to find it. So for instance, using some form of a memory scraper, like Mimikatz or Windows credential editor on my laptop to go scan through memory looking for credentials so I can do a Kerber roasting or a pass the hash, right? It's the normal user does not typically run memory scrapers and then Kerber roasting attacks, right? So same kind of thing about maybe if we planted an alternative user profile on a system, it's very difficult for a user to bash their way into another user's profile on the host. And so that's really the answer to the question, Daniel, is moving deception onto the production systems themselves in ways that, look, we know how malicious operators steal and get at information, and they feel safest on their system. And so making sure it's a policy violation to get at it in the first place really tunes that noise way down.
All right, great. Shawnee, I think this next one is for you, although I guess you may all have thoughts on it. I've heard people say that the best way to stop insider threats is not to hire insider threats. So I guess, is that possible? In terms of before you even hire the employee, are there red flags to look for when somebody may potentially be an insider threat to kind of preempt them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it goes back to what I was saying in the recruiting phase. You have to make sure that that person fits your culture and is going to subscribe to what your company culture is. But it also is when you're doing a background investigation, I know a lot of companies hire vendors who do a cursory check, for criminal records or their driving record, but actually doing a real world background investigation. I used to do it for police and fire. You learn all kinds of great gems when you don't just talk to their references. When you ask the references, who else should I talk to? Get some information, get former employees or former colleagues. And I think that will give you a much better picture of who you're actually bringing into your home, so to speak.
And I think Shawnee makes a great point. A lot of organizations miss is that let's say you're hiring someone for a senior network administration position or a chief cybersecurity position. People with privileged credentials and high level of access certainly warrant a much deeper investigation, maybe than someone with a different role that won't have access to those kind of environments. And so I think having kind of a gradient of investigation that's appropriate based on the kind of access this person is going to have. I don't see as much of that as I think we probably should out there. I don't know, Dan, what you've seen, or Shawnee, what you've seen as far as taking that kind of an approach.
All right, we got another one here that I think could be for either Dan or Shawnee. What if employees tend to resent being monitored to this extent for insider activity and interpret the surveillance as a lack of trust? How do you handle something like that?
So I'll make a couple of quick points, and then I think Shawnee will have something to add about that. But part of this is being really transparent with your workforce about why there is a program of training and awareness. And what I found is that when the training is on the unintentional or the unwitting employee, the person who doesn't realize that by clicking on a piece of email from somebody they didn't know, they're unwittingly allowing a Trojan horse malware to be inserted into their enterprise. Perhaps we saw that with Colonial Pipeline, and then you wind up with a ransomware case. So by focusing on that, people understand that it's in their interest, in everybody's interest, to do the right thing and build that positive culture. And so rather than framing it as surveilling people, it's the idea is that we all subscribe to these best practices in the interests of ensuring that our enterprise is able to carry forth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You're protecting your assets. And in the training and awareness program, like Dan mentioned, you're teaching people why you're doing what you're doing. You're teaching people that it's in their best interest and it's their responsibility to protect their assets, their colleagues. I mean, and then teach them what bad things can happen if they don't speak up, or if the company doesn't monitor things to protect the assets, loss of shareholder confidence, loss of jobs, your buddy could get fired. Like there's a whole bunch of bad things that can happen if people aren't acting as individuals, who are responsible as well.
Yeah, one of the things I've seen in focusing on the unintentional is spot on. One of the other things I've seen has been really effective is in your training program, make sure that some of the training focuses on how the employees can leverage this cyber training at home, right? And so they're seeing the direct value to them at home and for their personal lives, and you're basically upping that game across the board. It tends to reduce some of the sensitivity around it when they see the value, not just from a work perspective, but from a personal perspective as well.
I agree. I think that actually shows them that the company has them and their best interests at heart. It's not just the company saying, do this to take care of your company. I think that's a really important point, Wade.
I think this next one is probably more of a Wade question, but everyone can feel free to chime in. How does the cloud complicate technical methods for catching potential insiders?
Yeah, I mean, look, cloud solutions are fantastic. They're honest and growing like crazy. It doesn't complicate it per se. It just changes it. It's yet another environment to monitor, right? It's yet another kind of access that security teams and HR organizations and management, kind of needs to be aware of. And so, that yet another layer is yet another variable. And so it's not additive, right? It's exponential change in the number of things that we're having to monitor. And if we're honest, a lot of the cloud infrastructures are environments where the traditional security team doesn't have the kind of visibility they're used to having. Take work from home, right? If an employee connects from the enterprise, from the network firewalls and proxy systems, we can kind of see everywhere they go and what they're doing. If they're down at Starbucks, if they're not using the VPN, well then, not so much. And so it certainly provides more opportunity with less monitoring, and security teams, if we're honest, are playing catch up once again, right? The organizations have enhanced capabilities, SaaS applications and cloud structures, and security is still trying to catch up, honestly.
Let's see. I think we have time for about one more question. I really like this one. So once you detect an insider, what's the next step? We have two former government agents here. So do you call the FBI? Do you call the police? What's the way to handle the insider threat in terms of law enforcement beyond what you can do on the business side to protect your data and make sure that you've contained the insider? What's the next step after that?
Dan, you want to go first?
I'm going to let you go first, Shawnee.
All right. So from an investigator standpoint, you want to make sure that you've done the whole investigation. You can't just say, I found somebody bad and pass it to law enforcement. They're not going to take it. You have to make a beautiful package and put a big red bow on it and then present it to the right organization. And you might have to shop it around, to be honest. There are, FBI might not take it. Local law enforcement might take it. There's also other federal agencies that might take it, depending on what it is. Was it fraud? There are all different kinds of things to factor in there. If it is a large enough case, and when I say large enough, I mean the losses have to be large enough, then you can present it to a law enforcement agency. Otherwise, I'm sad to say, they're not going to take a lot of times they're not going to take smaller cases. They just don't have the bandwidth to investigate things like that.
So I'll just add that, it's an excellent question, but let's just be clear. We're talking about a spectrum here of insider threat. So someone might have improperly downloaded information, put it on a thumb drive, prepared to deliver it to an outside party, an adversary, but didn't do it. And where are we at with that? Or we could have someone who had a massive download of sensitive proprietary information and delivered that to an adversary. And those are two different things. It's one of the reasons why what's really important is this is company specific. And it's really important for you to think about empowering HR and your lawyer to work together on this, both to deal with these kinds of situations, but also so that everyone in the company understands that they're going to get a fair shake from the human resources folks and from the legal team, because everybody's innocent till proven otherwise in this country, and that needs to carry forth with these sorts of investigations as well. And so it's really important to do all the due diligence to conduct the investigation with the right focus, but at the same time, do it in a way that's consistent with your company ethos.
All right. Well, I think that's about all the time we have today. We've covered most of our questions, but if we didn't get to yours, we'll be sure to contact you after the webinar and get you an answer. Thank you very much to Daniel Hoffman and Shawnee Delaney and Wade Lance for joining us today. It was a great session, and I hope you guys all got something out of it. Thanks to everyone for attending as well. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to email you a copy of this session later on. And we'll also be emailing you a white paper written by Daniel and Shawnee on insider threats and doing a deeper dive on this topic, which is also very interesting. So look out for that in your inboxes. Our series of webinars on the view from the attacker will continue next month. Alyssa Knight will be returning, and she will be talking about how attackers disable endpoint protection such as EDR to perpetrate threats such as ransomware. She'll be doing a live attack on the cyber range and showing you how attackers do it. So if you want to see a blow-by-blow about how attackers are disabling endpoint protection, please join us in June. We'll be informing you about where to sign up for that webinar as well. Thanks everybody, and please check Illusive's events page at illusive.com for upcoming events that we have. Please stay safe in the meantime as everything starts hopefully going back to normal, and talk to you again soon.